They are the Pagans, and their motto:
They never made it to Hollywood. No documentary deals, no Netflix series, no sympathetic biker mythology built around their name. And yet, for 6 decades, the Pagans Motorcycle Club has operated as one of the most feared, most violent, and most deliberately invisible outlaw organizations in American history. That invisibility was never an accident, it was the strategy. The quiet beginning, nobody noticed. 1959. Prince George's County, Maryland. A Navy veteran named Lou Dobkin gathers 13 men around a table. No criminal ambitions are declared. No rules about territory or taxes or enforcement. Just motorcycles, brotherhood, and open roads. Dobkin designed their patch himself. Surtra, the Norse fire giant prophesied to burn the world to ash at the end of days. He chose it for its symbolism. Destruction followed by rebirth. Only through chaos, he believed, could something real be forged. It was a philosophy that sounded poetic in 1959. By 1970, it would read like a mission statement. Most people who know the Pagans MC story start in the middle. They start with the drug raids, the federal indictments, the brawls at concert venues, the gun seizures. They start when the Pagans were already a machine, but machines don't build themselves. And the story of how 13 men in denim jackets became one of America's most feared criminal organizations is the story nobody fully tells, because understanding the rise means understanding something uncomfortable. The Pagans were never meant to be what they became. They were engineered into it, step by step, by forces both inside and outside the club. The early Pagans were unremarkable. They rode Maryland backroads, drank at bars the Hells Angels would have ignored, and stayed out of the national press. By 1965, the club had expanded into Virginia and Pennsylvania, but they were still regional, still small, still, in the eyes of federal law enforcement, a nuisance rather than a threat. The FBI had its eyes on the Hells Angels. The outlaws were making noise in the Midwest. The Pagans were just there, wearing their patch, holding their meetings, riding their routes. That obscurity was their first real advantage, and they used it. Between 1965 and 1972, while law enforcement focused elsewhere, the Pagans quietly absorbed smaller clubs across the mid-Atlantic, not through negotiation, through pressure. A club in Delaware would receive a visit. A chapter in New Jersey would be given a choice: patch over or close down. Most patched over. The ones that refused learned quickly why refusal was not a real option. No headlines followed, no press releases. The Pagans grew in the dark, which meant they grew without resistance. By 1972, the club stretched from upstate New York to the Virginia coastline. 13 men had become several hundred, and the man who made that possible wasn't Lou Dobkin anymore. The architect nobody talked about. John Satan Marin did not inherit the Pagans, he conquered them. Before the Pagans, Marin led the Sons of Satan, a smaller club already known in Maryland for violence that exceeded what most biker groups were willing to attempt. When the Sons of Satan patched over into the Pagans in the mid-1960s, Marin didn't become a member, he became the dominant force. Dobkin's vision of freedom gave way to Marin's vision of hierarchy. The club called him Satan for a reason. He brought fire and order in equal measure. Marin saw the Pagans as an army, not a social club. He created national officers. He appointed chapter presidents and held them accountable with the kind of discipline that had nothing to do with rule books and everything to do with consequences. He built an enforcement layer inside the club. Men whose primary function was ensuring loyalty moved in one direction only, downward. Under Marin, the phrase "Mother Club" took on its real meaning. There was a circle of leadership that sat above all chapters, that made decisions that could not be appealed, and that answered to no one outside its own walls. This structure was not copied from the Hells Angels. It predated the Hells Angels' own national reorganization. The Pagans, under Marin, created a blueprint for outlaw club governance that would influence how every major 1%er club organized itself in the following decades. But governance alone doesn't explain the Pagans' rise. What explains it is geography. While the Hells Angels dominated the West Coast and the outlaws carved up the Midwest, the Pagans claimed the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, specifically the corridor running through New Jersey. Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia. This was not territory anyone was fully watching. It was the backyard of America's most densely populated region, saturated with port cities, industrial towns, and populations large enough to sustain serious criminal enterprise, yet overlooked by federal organized crime units that were still primarily focused on the Italian Mafia. The Pagans didn't just move into this corridor, they embedded themselves in it. Clubhouses were placed near ports, chapters were established in industrial suburbs. Networks were built with dock workers, truckers, and local politicians who preferred not to know too much. The club didn't announce itself, it simply became impossible to ignore. By the mid-1970s, the Pagans controlled methamphetamine distribution across the entire East Coast corridor. They didn't manufacture it yet, that would come later. But they controlled the routes, the pricing, and the enforcement. If you moved drugs between New York and Virginia without paying the Pagans, you didn't do it twice. The war that built them. No organization in history was made without an enemy. For the Pagans, that enemy was the Hells Angels, but calling it a rivalry undersells what actually happened between these two clubs. What happened between the Pagans and the Hells Angels in the 1970s and 1980s was a territorial war fought across two coastlines, in bar parking lots and highway rest stops and clubhouse raids, with a casualty list that law enforcement still hasn't fully compiled. The conflict began over expansion. The Hells Angels, emboldened by their West Coast dominance and growing national reputation, began pushing east. They established chapters in New York and Connecticut. They announced their presence in regions the Pagans considered controlled territory. This was not an accident. The Hells Angels understood exactly what they were doing. They were testing whether the Pagans were real or theater. The Pagans answered immediately. In 1974, a Hells Angels affiliated member was killed in a confrontation with Pagans in New York. The details were never fully established in court. What was established was that the Pagans held a chapter meeting within 48 hours, and the following week, 2 Hells Angels vehicles were destroyed. No arrests were made. No witnesses came forward. The message was clear, without a single statement being issued. This pattern repeated itself with terrifying consistency across the following decade. A pagan would be assaulted, a Hells Angels affiliate would be killed, a pagan clubhouse would be targeted, a Hells Angels-linked business would burn. Both sides maintained silence with law enforcement. Both sides handled their accounting internally, and both sides grew stronger from the conflict rather than weaker, because war, in the outlaw world, was the most effective recruiting tool ever invented. Men who wanted to prove something always found their way to whichever side was currently fighting. The Pagans, fighting on their home turf, fighting in defense of territory they had spent a decade building, attracted the kind of recruit that consolidates power. Not men looking for a club, men looking for a war. By 1984, the Pagans had repelled every significant Hells Angels expansion attempt on the East Coast. The Hells Angels never established a permanent, functioning chapter in pagan territory. They tried, multiple times. The Pagans made each attempt untenable through a combination of direct violence, legal harassment, and the kind of community pressure that comes from controlling local criminal economies. This outcome was not guaranteed. At multiple points in the 1970s, law enforcement sources believed the Hells Angels would overwhelm the Pagans through sheer size and national organizational advantage. That it didn't happen tells you something critical about what the Pagans had built. They were not just a motorcycle club, they were a territorial operation, and territory was the one thing they would not surrender under any circumstances. The chemistry that changed everything. Methamphetamine changed the Pagans the way it changed every organization it touched, but the Pagans were different in one important respect. They didn't just sell meth, they manufactured it. And the transition from distributor to manufacturer, from middleman to source, is the transition that turned the Pagans' MC from a violent outlaw club into a criminal enterprise with the operational profile of a mid-sized industrial company. The shift began in the late 1970s, in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, in rural areas where nobody was watching closely enough. The Pagans had members with chemistry backgrounds, members with connections to pharmaceutical supply chains, and members with the kind of organizational discipline required to run a manufacturing operation without advertising its existence. Clandestine labs appeared and disappeared. Product moved through existing networks that were already invisible to law enforcement because they'd been built specifically to avoid detection. By 1985, federal investigators had begun to understand what they were dealing with. The DEA's first major pagan-focused intelligence assessment described the club as a vertically integrated narcotics organization, a phrase typically reserved for South American cartels. It was the first time a domestic outlaw motorcycle club had earned that designation. The money that came from meth manufacturing was not what most people imagine. It wasn't spent on luxury. It was reinvested. New chapter houses, new weapons, new legal defense funds, new corrupted relationships with local officials who asked few questions and received reliable cash in return. The Pagans built infrastructure with criminal revenue the way a legitimate company builds infrastructure with profit. Deliberately, strategically, for the long term. This financial discipline was unusual. Most outlaw clubs of the era lived month to month, crisis to crisis, federal raid to federal raid. The Pagans planned across years. They maintained reserve funds. They retained lawyers before they needed them, not after. They understood that the legal system was not something to be avoided through violence. It was something to be navigated through resources. When federal investigators finally moved in force against the Pagans in the late 1980s and 1990s, they found something that surprised them. An organization that could absorb arrests without collapsing. When members went to prison, structures remained. When chapters were raided, operations moved. The Pagans had redundancy built into everything they did. Leadership could be replaced without a crisis because leadership had always been distributed across multiple trusted layers. This is what made the Pagans genuinely dangerous in a way that pure violence never could. Violence is visible. Violence creates witnesses and evidence and pressure. Organizational resilience is invisible. And the Pagans' ability to survive federal pressure that would have destroyed most criminal organizations was a product of decisions made 20 years earlier when John Marin sat down and decided what kind of organization this was going to be. The federal campaigns that couldn't finish it. The FBI first opened a dedicated Pagans file in 1972. Over the following 5 decades, federal and state law enforcement agencies would conduct more than 40 significant operations targeting the club. They seized drugs worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They arrested thousands of members and associates. They won convictions against chapter presidents, national officers, and enforcers at every level of the organization. And the Pagans MC is still operating today. That fact requires explanation, because the federal government's ability to dismantle organized crime in America is not theoretical. It dismantled the 5 families of the New York Mafia through sustained RICO prosecutions in the 1980s and 1990s. It destroyed the Medellin cartel. It crippled the Aryan Brotherhood's national leadership. It knows how to end criminal organizations. The Pagans have survived it for 50 years. Part of the answer is geography. The Pagans' territory spread across 17 states. Concentrated in an industrial corridor with no dominant city at its center, was structurally resistant to the kind of concentrated investigative pressure that had worked against centralized organizations. There was no equivalent of a Gotti arrest that could decapitate the whole structure. The Pagans had no Gotti. They had dozens of chapter presidents who operated with meaningful autonomy, connected to national leadership through loyalty and financial obligation rather than direct command. Operation Malchus, launched in 1983, resulted in 43 arrests and was publicly described by the Justice Department as a crippling blow to the club. Within 18 months, all 43 positions had been filled. The arrests created an opening period of internal tension, during which several chapters briefly competed for regional dominance. By 1985, that tension had resolved itself. The Pagans were operating at full capacity. Project Sunrise, a Pennsylvania state police operation running from 1996 to 1999, was more sophisticated. It utilized undercover officers embedded inside club support crews, phone surveillance, and financial tracking through 3 states. It resulted in 31 convictions, including 2 chapter presidents. The evidence was substantial. The sentences were real, and the club absorbed it. What law enforcement kept discovering, to their consistent frustration, was that the Pagans treated criminal prosecution the way a military organization treats casualties: expected, planned for, survivable. Members who went to prison maintained their status inside the club. Their families were supported through club funds. When they were released, they returned to positions of respect and, in many cases, authority. Prison time was not a career ender for a pagan. In some chapters, it was a credential. This created a prosecutorial problem that no indictment could solve. The threat of imprisonment is the primary tool of the American criminal justice system. Against an organization whose culture treated imprisonment as a known professional risk rather than a catastrophic outcome, that threat lost much of its power. The territory nobody wanted to cross. Ask law enforcement investigators who specialized in outlaw motorcycle clubs which patch they least wanted to see in their jurisdiction, and most of them will not say Hell's Angels, they will say Pagans. Not because the Pagans were necessarily larger or better funded, but because of what it meant when the Pagans moved into an area. The Pagans did not establish new territory gradually. They did not begin with a small chapter, build slowly, develop community relationships, and then gradually expand influence. They arrived completely. A charter was issued. A chapter house was established. Existing criminal enterprises in the area received the same offer that had been extended since the 1960s: operate under the Pagans' umbrella and pay accordingly, or face the consequences of refusing. The consequences had been established with enough historical specificity that most operations chose the umbrella. Atlantic City provides the clearest case study. When the Pagans established serious presence in Atlantic City in the early 1980s, shortly after casino gambling was legalized, they moved directly into the parallel economy that had always surrounded gambling: loan sharking, prostitution, drug supply to casino workers and patrons, security arrangements with establishments that couldn't use legitimate security firms. These were not operations they built from zero. They absorbed existing operations run by smaller, weaker organizations that understood the arithmetic involved. The Pagans collected a percentage of everything that moved, not because they provided a service, because they were the Pagans, and the Pagans were in Atlantic City, and that fact alone was sufficient justification for the payment. This was taxation enforced by reputation, and the reputation had been built over 20 years of exactly the kind of violence that made refusal genuinely dangerous. What made this model sustainable was its simplicity. The Pagans did not manage the operations they taxed. They didn't hire staff, maintain facilities, or take on the operational risks of running criminal businesses directly. They collected. The businesses ran themselves, absorbed their own risks, paid their monthly obligations, and remained viable because the alternative was worse. This was a franchise model of organized crime, built in an era before anyone used that language. The DEA field office in Philadelphia described it in a 1992 internal report as the most efficient criminal taxation system observed on the East Coast outside of traditional organized crime. That comparison was deliberate. The report went on to note that the Pagans' operational model resembled the Mafia's structure in the 1950s, more than it resembled any contemporary outlaw biker organization. The relationships nobody discussed. The Pagans did not operate in isolation. That is the part of the story that the headlines consistently miss because it is the part that is hardest to prosecute. A Pagan member going to prison for drug trafficking is a story with a beginning and an end. A Pagan chapter's relationship with a specific Mafia family, sustained over decades through mutual benefit and mutual silence, is a story that rarely sees a courtroom. But the relationships were real, and they shaped the Pagans' trajectory more than any single federal operation. In the 1970s, the Pagans and the Philadelphia mob under Angelo Bruno established what investigators later described as a working division of criminal labor. The mob controlled the upper levels of narcotics distribution, the importation, the wholesale, the financing. The Pagans controlled street-level enforcement, retail distribution networks, and the specific kind of violence that the mob preferred not to be directly associated with. Money moved in both directions. Information did not move to law enforcement in either direction. This arrangement survived Bruno's assassination in 1980 and the subsequent Philadelphia mob war. It survived the federal decimation of the Philadelphia family through the 1980s and 1990s. Relationships that had been built between specific individuals transferred to their successors because both organizations understood the value of the arrangement and neither wanted to give it up. Similar relationships existed in New York, in New Jersey, and in several New England cities where the Pagans had chapters and the Mafia had historical interests. These were not partnerships of equals. The Pagans were always the junior party in terms of capital and sophistication, but they provided something the Mafia either couldn't or preferred not to do: directly street-level violence and enforcement that was both credible and deniable. A Pagan doing enforcement work had no institutional connection to the Mafia family that hired him. If he was arrested, he said nothing. If he was not arrested, the work was done. The Pagans also developed relationships with Colombian and later Mexican drug trafficking organizations as the narcotics trade evolved in the 1990s and 2000s. The club's geographic position made it a natural distribution partner for cartels that needed to move product into the dense population centers of the Northeast without managing last-mile logistics themselves. The Pagans were already there. They already had networks. They already had enforcement. They just needed supply. These cartel relationships transformed the scale of the Pagans' drug operations without fundamentally changing their structure. The club was still collecting, still distributing, still using the same enforcement model they had used since the 1970s. The product had changed. The revenues had increased by orders of magnitude. The internal wars, nobody survived. Every empire eventually turns on itself. The Pagans were no exception. But what made the Pagans' internal conflicts different from those of other organizations was that they were almost entirely invisible. Itself, in the 1980s, people died in restaurants and on sidewalks and in front of witnesses. The press covered it. Law enforcement tracked it. It became part of the public record. When the Pagans went to war internally, people disappeared. Bodies turned up in circumstances that obscured the organizational context. Members left the club under conditions that were never publicly explained. Chapters were dissolved and reformed in ways that only made sense if you understood the internal politics that preceded them. From the outside, it looked like routine criminal chaos. From the inside, it was something far more methodical. The conflicts typically centered on three things: money, territory. The national president was imprisoned. The succession was not always clean. Factions formed around competing candidates. Competing candidates were sometimes eliminated before the succession could be resolved. The club's internal structure, which was designed to prevent external penetration, also made internal disputes extremely difficult to resolve through any mechanism other than violence. One former ATF informant, debriefed in the early 2000s, described the Pagan internal culture with a phrase that investigators found memorable: "The people who last are the ones who make the others nervous." This was not leadership through charisma, or competence, or loyalty alone. It was leadership through the credible threat of personal consequence for disloyalty. The most dangerous men inside the club were not necessarily the most violent. They were the most unpredictable. Unpredictability was protection. If no one could anticipate what you would do when crossed, no one wanted to cross you. The internal wars of the 1990s, never fully documented and never fully prosecuted, resulted in the elimination of several dozen members whose names appear in law enforcement records marked simply as whereabouts unknown. Some eventually surfaced, others did not. The ones who did not were absorbed into the statistical background of missing persons cases that no agency had the resources or the political will to investigate. This impunity was not accidental, it was structural. The Pagans had spent decades ensuring that investigations into their activities required witnesses who would not come forward and evidence that would not survive chain of custody scrutiny. The same architecture that protected them from external prosecution protected their internal violence from external examination. The recruitment machine. One of the persistent mysteries of the Pagans' MC is their ability to replenish membership after major law enforcement actions. Arrests remove members, prison terms remove them for years, deaths remove them permanently. And yet, Throughout 6 decades of sustained federal attention, the club's membership has never collapsed below a functional threshold, and the recruitment pipeline has always refilled. Understanding how requires understanding who the Pagans have always recruited and why those people chose to come. The club did not primarily recruit from the biker community, not in the traditional sense. They recruited from military veterans, from prison populations, from small criminal crews that were looking for larger organizational backing, and from the extended social networks of existing members. These were not men who stumbled onto a pagan event and thought the patch looked interesting. These were men who were specifically identified, specifically approached, and specifically evaluated for compatibility with what the club actually was. The evaluation process was substantial. A prospect did not join the Pagans MC the way a person joins a motorcycle club. He entered a period of sponsorship and observation that could last years. During that period, he was expected to be available for tasks that the club required, tasks that ranged from mundane support work to activities that created legal exposure. The tasks were not accidental. They were designed to evaluate commitment and, critically, to ensure that by the time a man received his patch, he had already done things he could not discuss with law enforcement without incriminating himself. This was not a bureaucratic policy. It was an organic development that the club had refined across decades of experience. By the time a man became a pagan, he was structurally bound to the organization through shared legal risk. His silence was not a matter of loyalty alone, it was a matter of survival. The military pipeline was particularly important and consistently underestimated by federal investigators. The Pagans had always recruited heavily from veterans, dating back to Dobkin's own Navy background. Veterans brought discipline, a tolerance for hierarchical authority, training in violence, and a cultural discomfort with civilian life that the club explicitly offered to address. The Pagans provided a structure that replicated, in a recognizable way, the organizational experience of military service: ranks, missions, accountability, brotherhood. It was a dark mirror of something genuine. By 2010, the club's recruitment from special operations veterans and combat veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan was significant enough that federal investigators flagged it specifically in joint intelligence assessments. Men with specialized training in surveillance evasion, improvised weapons, and close-quarters violence were joining an organization that had operational uses for all 3 skill sets. The combination was concerning enough to prompt dedicated monitoring. The digital age they adapted to. Most criminal organizations struggled with the transition to a world of digital surveillance. The Pagans adapted with what law enforcement investigators later described as uncomfortable sophistication. They did not ignore the threat of digital monitoring, they built around it. The Pagans had observed over decades how cell phone tracking, email surveillance, and financial monitoring had destroyed other organizations. They watched the FBI's successes and they adjusted. Before many law enforcement agencies had finished writing their digital surveillance protocols, the Pagans had already implemented countermeasures that reflected a genuine understanding of what those protocols would look for. Burner phones rotated on schedules that disrupted pattern analysis. Significant operational communications moved to in-person meetings in locations chosen for surveillance difficulty. Financial flows were distributed across multiple small transactions and legitimate business fronts, rather than concentrated through systems that triggered reporting requirements. The organizational shift required to implement these practices was significant. The club did it without an IT department, without a consultant, and without producing documentation that could later be used in evidence. What made this adaptation possible was the club's existing culture of operational security. Pagans members had always been told that silence was survival, that phones were unreliable. That trust was verified through behavior, not words. The digital adaptation did not require a cultural revolution. It required applying existing principles to new technological contexts. The culture had always said, "Assume you are being watched." The digital age just changed what watching looked like. Federal investigators who worked pagan cases in the 2010s consistently noted that penetrating the club's communications required significantly more resources than penetrating comparable organizations. A wiretap would yield minimal information, because significant conversations were not happening on the wiretapped phone. Physical surveillance would reveal meetings, but not the substance of those meetings, because the meetings themselves followed protocols that minimized observable content. Grand jury subpoenas produced witnesses who genuinely had nothing to say, because the information architecture was designed to give each member only what he needed to know. The club was practicing what intelligence agencies call compartmentalization. It is the single most effective defense against informants, because it means that an informant can only compromise the small section of the organization he has direct access to. The Pagans had built this structure instinctively, over decades, for exactly the reasons intelligence agencies build it, because it works. The national footprint, nobody fully mapped. The Pagans' geographic expansion between 2000 and 2020 followed a pattern that was both aggressive and carefully managed. The club's traditional territory, the Mid-Atlantic Corridor, remained the center of gravity, but new chapters appeared in states where the Pagans had previously had no formal presence: Ohio, Georgia, South Carolina, Montana, Texas. Each new chapter followed the same template that had been established in the 1960s, an existing relationship between the national leadership and men in the target area. A patching-in meeting, usually in New Jersey, where the new members formally joined the club under its full constitution. A clubhouse established at a specific address. Local criminal networks receiving the same choices that criminal networks had always received when the Pagans arrived. The expansion was not public. The Pagans did not issue press releases or announce new chapter openings. Law enforcement typically learned about new chapters through informants or through surveillance of the patching-in meetings, which they monitored when they could. By the time a chapter was publicly known, it was usually already established and operational. What drove the expansion? The same thing that had always driven pagan growth: opportunity and pressure. When a region's criminal economy was fragmented and unorganized, the Pagans moved in as consolidators. When existing criminal organizations in a region were weakened by law enforcement action, the Pagans moved in to fill the vacuum. The timing of new chapter openings consistently correlated with either federal operations against competing organizations or the emergence of specific criminal economies, opioid distribution networks, weapons trafficking corridors that the Pagans were positioned to serve. By 2020, the club had chapters in more states than it ever had in its history. The growth happened during a period of intensified federal law enforcement attention. This was not coincidence. Organizations that survive sustained federal pressure tend to emerge from it more resilient, not less, because the pressure eliminates the weak elements and forces the remaining structure to become more sophisticated. The federal campaigns of the 1990s and 2000s did not destroy the Pagans. They upgraded them. The question that remains unanswered. So here is the question that the Pagans' 66-year history demands an answer to. Is the Pagans MC a motorcycle club that became a criminal organization? Or was it always a criminal organization that used motorcycles as its cover? The honest answer is that it was neither. Not entirely. Not simply. Lou Dobkin's original vision was real. The brotherhood was real. For many members across many decades, the club provided something: genuine community, identity, structure, belonging that had nothing directly to do with criminal enterprise. Men who joined the Pagans in the 1970s and 1980s were not all signing up for a life of narcotics trafficking and federal prosecution. Some of them were. Many of them were not. They were signing up for a way of life, a specific masculine culture, a set of relationships that the civilian world had never offered them. But the organization they joined was, at its leadership level, deliberately and strategically criminal. The men who ran the Pagans MC understood exactly what they were building. They made conscious decisions about drug manufacturing and territorial enforcement and law enforcement corruption and internal violence. Those decisions were not incidental to the club. They were the club. The tragedy, and it is a tragedy, even when the victims are outlaws, is that the club's genuine elements and its criminal elements were deliberately fused. A man who joined for the Brotherhood found himself over time exposed to the criminal infrastructure. The exposure was gradual. The legal jeopardy accumulated slowly. By the time he understood fully what he was part of, the structural bond that came from shared criminal exposure had already been established. This is why the Pagans survived everything the federal government threw at them for 66 years, not because they were smarter than law enforcement, not because they were more violent than competing organizations, but because they had built something that genuine human need sustained. The criminal enterprise was attached, deliberately and effectively, to something real. As of 2025, the Pagans MC operates chapters across more than 15 states. Federal investigations are ongoing, arrests are still being made, members are still going to prison, and the club is still recruiting, still patching in new members, still collecting from the criminal economies it has claimed across the East Coast and beyond. The patch is still being worn, the fire giant is still burning. And 66 years after 13 men sat around a table in Maryland with no criminal ambitions at all, law enforcement still has not found an answer to the only question that matters. How do you end something that was built specifically to survive you? If this story gripped you, the kind of story most channels never touch, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There are more cases like this coming. Stories where the truth runs deeper than anything you've heard before. Thank you for watching.